So for quite some time now, I have tried to encourage us to think about when we run into archetypes within the biblical text. And let me share with you why I think it's important. Because if we can recognize them in the biblical text, then we can recognize them in our lives, in the lives of our communities, and in the lives of our planet. So, the archetype of 40 days in the wilderness. I don't need to explain that one to anyone. And I think it's interesting. Every time the wilderness shows up in many ways as its own personality within the biblical text. So it is actually part of, among the players, let us say, of the narrative. We might think about that when we think about our own relationship with the earth and how the earth brings its own identity to our narrative, that up until, well, for a long time, we were so human-centered in how we thought about the planet. It was just kind of there for us. So let me just remind you of a couple of places when this wilderness motif shows up and the purpose that it plays. So we can recall that Moses, when he ran from Israel because he was being hunted down by the Pharaoh because he killed an Egyptian taskmaster, when he realized what an abusive situation this was and realized that he himself was a child of Israel. And he finds himself one day in the desert and still thinking about his own identity, nevertheless, born in the palace of Egypt, yet being born to an Israelite woman who was a slave, and what was his role on the planet as a result of that. And poof, a bush burst into flame in the wilderness. And that began a journey for Moses of really developing his new identity and calling. Then let's kind of fast forward and see the Israelites. So the legend goes, spend 40 years in the wilderness, and it's very interesting that they go from a place of slavery and they're invited to go to a place of freedom. And when you read through the desert narratives, it's all about them going, yeah, but we want the security of Egypt and we want the security of slavery, and we don't want to have to develop this new narrative where we're going to have to trust. So in many ways, the desert place is the place where we are invited to go and wrestle with the emerging of a new identity that is much more capable of being a healing light to the world. So this story that we're about to hear of Jesus entering the wilderness for, of course, it's going to be the number 40, right? That is the number of his tradition, is actually for the same purpose. It's, so, who are you anyway? And what is going to motivate you? And what choices around the direction of your life are you going to take? And so before I read it, just a couple of things. So we know this narrative to include a tempter or a devil, and in many ways this is just a throwaway character, right? Amazing literary technique where the writer is having to reveal an inner struggle that Jesus faced before starting his public ministry. So, you know, sometimes the language of our tradition kind of, we're dealing with the devil. Where does that come from? I don't believe in it, all right? So it plays a role in revealing in another narrative unfolding. I think the other piece I want to say something about here is, keep in mind we're still, that the testimony of the early church comes from a place where they still understand God as part of a larger pecking order, right? Up there, lots of power. We just need to access it. And if Jesus has this special relationship with God, then Jesus also has this very special power. I'm going to suggest that the tradition keeps trying to put Jesus onto the pecking order, and Jesus keeps saying, that's not what I came to do or where I exist. It's kind of like when people, when people kind of nudge me and say, hey, like, don't you have any pull with the guy upstairs? It's about time it rained. It's the same kind of, it's just as ridiculous to think that, you know, Jesus can turn bread into stone as it is to think that I can be responsible for getting God to make it rain. So keep in mind that that worldview is still kind of coming through this particular passage. And I don't want it to kind of get us off what the main thing is, which is Jesus is trying to figure out who he is and what his vocation is. And this passage, I think, is also interesting in that we've just come out of his baptism, and in this baptismal experience, Jesus has gotten this real affirmation that he is beloved. And once again, another archetype, right? We are all invited to start this journey into the wilderness with a deep understanding of ourselves as being beloved. Then Jesus was led up by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. He fasted for 40 days and 40 nights, and afterwards he was famished. The tempter came and said to him, "If you are the Son of God, command these stones to become loaves of bread." But he answered, "It is written, one does not live by bread alone, but by every word coming from the mouth of God." Then the devil took him to the holy city and placed him on the pinnacle of the temple, saying to him, "If you are the Son of God, throw yourself down. For it is written, he will command his angels concerning you, and on their hands they will bear you up, so that you will not dash your foot against the stone." Jesus said to him, "Again, it is written, do not put the Lord your God to the test." Again, the devil took him to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their splendor, and said to him, "All these I will give you if you will fall down and worship me." Jesus said to him, "Get away with you, for it is written, worship the Lord your God and serve only him." And then the devil left him, and suddenly angels came and waited on him. And so included in my thoughts this morning are a few thoughts that come from a woman whose name is Debbie Thomas, who has a blog entitled Journey with Jesus. So the question for us this morning, and it was the question for Jesus as well, was, can we trust this confirmation of our identity as beloved when we enter those wilderness times in our lives? And I'm going to suggest, like I've already done, that what that experience invites us to do is to consider our own narratives and challenges in light of who we are as beloved of God. So let's just move through these temptations. And this first one, I love what Debbie Thomas does with. So the first temptation comes in the face of hunger. If you are the Son of God, command this stone to become a loaf of bread. The temptation implies that those who are beloved should not hunger. In the devil's economy, unmet desire is an aberration, not an integral part of what it means to be human. And so this particular question invites us to examine our own hunger for food, for love, for intimacy, for security, And the real question is, can we sit in our hunger? Can we honor it? Can we recognize that it is a part of being human without going to the lengths that some of us do to feed it? Can we in fact inquire about the hunger beneath our hunger? Can we hunger and still live? Can we live with unfulfilled desire and still flourish? What Debbie Thomas suggests, and I really like this, is that hunger in itself is not a virtue. It's a classroom. To sit patiently and tenderly with our deepest hungers and unfulfilled desires is to become a student of these things. And yet to live with that profound hunger and at the same time knowing ourselves to be embraced as beloved, very hard. I know you know those are very hard places. So I think the invitation is to recognize and to know deeply that we can be loved and hungry at the same time. We can hope and we can hurt at the same time. But most of all, we can trust that when we find ourselves in those desert places, nourishment will be provided. It may not come in the form that we chose, but it will nevertheless feed us. And I think as we're on this topic of hunger, and it's always easy, right? When we don't have to look inside ourselves, we can look at something or someone out there. Consider how hunger on this continent has driven our consumption and therefore has had a much larger implication. It's bigger than what we put in our mouths. It's what we gather around ourselves to create the illusion of security. Which takes us into the second temptation. And the second temptation targets Jesus' vulnerability. God will command his angels concerning you, the devil promises Jesus. On their hands they will bear you up so you will not dash your foot against a stone. The implication that as beloved, as those who belong to God, we have some sort of entitlement to safety and well-being. It is such an enticing lie because I think it targets among our deepest fears about what it means to be human in a broken and dangerous world. I think we'd like to believe that our belovedness will provide us with a measure of safety. But in fact, in that wilderness experience, in that coming to terms with identity, Jesus affirms that he is called to live in a place of vulnerability. He is not prepared to take the safe way. And of course, it's interesting, once again, when you take it to look at something else and go, well, where does that work out? Well, our species has chosen weapons over vulnerability. Yet we all know what an illusion a cache of weapons is. And in fact, the only thing that makes us feel safer is doubling its size and tripling its size, as opposed to trusting that, in fact, in our vulnerability, we experience true safety. The third temptation targets Jesus' ego. After showing all the kingdoms of the world, the devil promises him glory and authority. There's this implication that if you're going to be God's beloved, you need not labor in obscurity. And Jesus responds that rather than choosing a road of fame or visibility or recognition or clout, right, the pecking order, doesn't want to have anything to do with that, that he will live instead in a place of humility and surrender. Let me ask you, is that not the most challenging invitation ever? to let go of everything we think we want and that we've been driven to want and do, and suddenly find ourselves in a place where we are prepared to surrender and trust that in that place of abdication and humility, that in fact the deepest needs for our own selves and for the planet will be realized. Let me just say a few final things. Those who crafted this particular narrative begin it with the words, "And then the Spirit led him out into the desert." And I think that's another sign. It's another sign that we're invited to trust those wilderness places. Now, I will make an aside here, and I will say that if you have wrestled with bipolar disorder or depression or anxiety most of your life, I am not identifying those as wilderness places. Those are places of unhealth. I think we need to determine the difference between those, and I think we need to recognize that then when we do find ourselves in what is a real wilderness experience, that we are able to go deeper and trust that we have found ourselves in this place for the purpose of our own deepest healing, which will then contribute to the healing of the planet. And I think that I am prepared to affirm and confirm that wilderness places can be profoundly wretched places. And therefore, they are places where it is particularly challenging to trust. And don't hear me saying that patriarchal for your own good. No, it's not this. This is for your own good. God only sends you what you can handle. Get rid of those platitudes. Go instead deeper to do your own personal wrestling with what is showing up within you. The other thing I might add is that whereas I look in the rearview mirror at those wilderness places in my life that I didn't think I was going to got through, and was also grateful for the new narratives that came out of that wilderness time. Let me also say that those are never places we go to without kicking and screaming. The end of a marriage, the death of a spouse, the confirmation of a health crisis, the loss of a job, you know these places. And yet they are our companions for our deepest healing. So I'm just wanting then for us to think a bit of what's going on the planet right now. Because it seems to me that the planet is in its own wilderness season, is it not? That somehow forces larger than ourselves are showing up and asking us to examine our patterns, our practices, our addictions, our entitlements. And it's already a bit scary, and it might get scarier, but perhaps it is this wilderness time on the planet that is required to challenge us finally to exercise our power to change things. So let's look at 3 or 4 different examples. Let's look at the Democratic nominee conversation. What new narrative, is the question, will capture the imagination of our neighbors to the south? Or look at what's happening across our country at this time around our narrative, around our relationship to the land and our relationship to our Indigenous people. What does the present standoff say about these things? And what is our wilderness assignment in the middle of this season? And then there's the coronavirus. What other reminder do we need that we are so tightly bound together in this web of life? And then again, melting ice caps, kicking and screaming to rethink our place on the planet and all of our entitlements. So Lent is not a time to give up chocolate. It is not a time to do penance for being human, as much as it is a time to embrace all that it means to be human. Human and hungry. Human and vulnerable. Human and beloved. And so I invite you during this time of contemplation to consider again, what cosmic assignment, what sacred assignment might have your name on it as we travel this season together through the wilderness.